I'm not sure how many of you guys are PBS viewers at all, but I am a main sort of overseas correspondent for our evening news show, PBS NewsHour. For most of my career, I've lived overseas. I lived in Yemen and Dubai and Afghanistan, and then eventually I spent a lot of time living in Lebanon, in Beirut, before moving to New York. So I've been covering a lot of conflict. Effectively, I've been working a lot in conflict impacted parts of the world, whether it's Africa or the Middle East or South Asia. A lot of my work has focused on both Yemen and Afghanistan. And so, while I don't always just cover the war, I do cover a lot of the humanitarian impact of conflict. That has been a particular focus for me over the years. And obviously in 2021, Afghanistan and the situation there really came to a head. So that was really became a huge part of what we were doing at PBS and our coverage. Tomorrow actually marks the second anniversary of the fall of Kabul to the Taliban. And so by the time we got to the 15th of August, 2021, my team and I, this had been actually our third trip into the country just that year so far. So we at PBS had really leaned into that story, what was happening in Afghanistan, what the Taliban's advancement for women, what was happening with the collapsing economy and the struggling economy, as well as, of course, the fighting. So this became all of these subjects as to what was happening there, how it was impacting, the 35-40 million people who lived there was all really coming to a head. Now, obviously, in the 2 years since the Taliban have taken over, the situation has become very dire, economically, especially for women and women and girls. Women's rights are more restricted in Afghanistan than anywhere else on the planet. But I was doing a talk with a group, a large international NGO based around women, Women for Women International. And one of it was sort of a big Zoom with over 100 people. And one person asked me after my talk, they said to me, and this is related to immigration, they said to me, how do we handle it whenever we have immigrants who come over, or migrants or refugees who come over from, and the culture shock is such that they might restrict the rights of their own daughters in a way that isn't even legal in the United States. How do we help these communities, but at the same time protect, the women's rule of law? And it really got me thinking about this subject and about what my work and the work of my colleagues really hopes to achieve, which is to really help people understand. And this is what I said to the person, understand that these communities didn't plan to be here. And for me, a big part of what I'm trying to communicate to people is that, what it is like to be a war refugee, to have had a life planned out, mapped out in your home country, a nice life, a profession, a job, a business, and a family, and a plan to raise that family there under those cultural norms and within that society. And so that's something that is facing, many Afghan families who very suddenly overnight literally just ran to the airport with passports and very little else. So that is a microcosm of it, but it's really something that we get to in our reporting. If I could get the public to take away just two things, the first one would be to help people understand what people are fleeing, and the second one, just how dangerous the situation is. Whether or not people are fleeing the war in Syria or whether they're fleeing the conflict in Afghanistan. But the second thing is to remember that it is quite a unique and challenging feature of life to be a war refugee in any country. But in the United States, after Kabul fell and there was the airlift of Afghans and Afghan allies their families from Kabul airport. There were over 120,000 people airlifted out of Kabul to around the world in less than 2 weeks. Over 90,000 of those came to the United States, and it was by far the biggest ever non-combatant airlift of people in U.S. history. So this is a huge, a massive example of what happens all the time. This is a scalable example of what it's like to be a war refugee and coming into these new cultures and communities very, very suddenly. And, you know, most people don't often get that kind of opportunity, but when they do, they still face similar challenges. So that's really, you know, been what I hope to put across in my reports. And so what I want to share with you now is just to sort of take you into some of that reporting, to really see what the situation was like for people who you might just see, whether they're in the street or in your local grocery store, or you bump into them anywhere in local communities. Whenever we're really talking about people, especially the Afghans that had fled this particular or in this particular collapse. So let me just share my screen here. I'm going to open with. Actually, I'm going to open with some photos. So this is just to give you a very basic idea of what it was like at Kabul airport during the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban in August of 2021. You know, within hours, we had thousands, in fact, tens of thousands by the end of the day, people rushing to the airport. Many of those people had permission to flee, many of them to the United States or to European countries that they'd been working with as translators or in embassies and human rights organizations, and who were now targets of the Taliban. But visa processing had become so slow that they didn't have the visa, but they did qualify for that visa. So people took to simply having to wave the flags of the countries that they themselves were trying to get to. That's just a tiny snippet of what the situation was like. I took this photograph here on top. I climbed up on top of one of the walls, the barriers that the American forces and British forces had pulled out to try to keep the crowds back. And people, you know, this was really a sign of just how dense these crowds were, and the Taliban were mingling around amongst them. We have one person who put up a sign, held up just a handwritten sign saying, "Australia, we have visas." So there was just absolute chaos. It was really, really difficult for anybody to be able to get through and actually get processed. These experiences were also experienced by children. You know, people were fleeing as families. They were not sending, you know, one person on ahead. They knew there wasn't time. So it wasn't like very often you'll find, you know, when a family needs to get out of a conflict zone, you might send one person ahead and then they help process the paperwork for the rest. But as Afghanistan fell and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people actually fled to the airport in the end, they came with their children. So it was a hugely dangerous place to bring them, but it was that in itself was a reflection of just how terrified they were of Taliban retribution. These were some scenes from inside. This is one happy story, actually. This was a family of a very senior Afghan journalist who was wanted by the Taliban, and he happened to be in the United States when this happened, and his extended family managed to get out. And this is a complex where an area within the airport where they were sorting those who had managed to get through the gates and past the soldiers who were promised a place on a plane. This was that family. This is a huge moment of relief By this stage, they had spent 2 days trying to get into the airport. Some children were lost in the crush. Some children were separated from their parents. Some parents were killed in the chaos and the panicked crowds. Some people were lost in the crush of those crowds and in the heat. And these photographs, I did a story for PBS where the children who had been separated were then taken, those who were discovered by American Marines were then taken inside the airport, and they had to set up like a very makeshift creche for them. And they were being taken care of by US soldiers. And while they tried to find their families or connect them with any family members, you can see this kid here was all ready for his journey. And he was actually being looked after by the American chaplain for that's her over watching over him for the Marines at the airport. This is the families just as they're about to board a flight. They are being processed. They'll have their fingerprints taken. I mean, by this stage, children have been standing in line, sleeping in the street sometimes, sleeping in the grass of the grassy areas of the airport for days. So these families were absolutely exhausted. That was the last thing this is the last thing that several 100,000 Afghans saw of their country in August of 2021. And yet, in many ways, when it comes to those who were trying to leave, these were indeed the lucky ones. These were the enormous military aircraft carriers that they took out all the seats, and they told everybody that you could not at any point bring proper luggage. A woman could bring a purse in which there really was only space for maybe some photographs as well as paperwork and passports. So on the tarmac, there were piles and piles of luggage and suitcases that people had been forced to abandon because, of course, the priority was to get as many people on these flights as opposed to luggage. This is what it looked like when they asked everybody to sit down. They took all the seats out. There was no seating in the middle. Normally in these military planes, when you're transporting personnel, there would be rows of seats in the center going straight up. And they took all of those out. Now, this little girl, I couldn't help but take a photograph of her here. She actually wore a sparkly kind of princess dress for her journey, and this was her flying to a new life, really, and it was quite an extraordinary scene. I was able to take these photographs. This is what the plane looks like when it's taken off, because I flew on this plane with these refugees. We were all flying to Abu Dhabi, to Qatar, to Doha, the capital of Qatar, where they would then be sorted. It could take some months for them to be sorted, but eventually they would be flown to the United States. These people were bound for the United States. And some of these families that were just close around me here had been the families of translators with the US military. And this is just scenes of those. Everyone was utterly exhausted and lay down and slept for much of the flight because they had been in the street trying to get on this flight probably for days, maybe longer than a week. But what I want to share with you now is a little bit, more impactful, is essentially what it sort of felt like and sounded like at Kabul airport during the actual evacuation. So I'm just going to show you some videos that I hope can really communicate that. I'm going to go here too. Yeah. And just let me know if you have any trouble hearing or listening to this.
Each day brings growing desperation at Kabul International Airport's perimeter walls. US! At this entrance gate, British soldiers try to maintain order amongst frantic civilians, anxious to make evacuation flights out, as Taliban soldiers, victors in this war, watch. British troops are here to process people who have been approved for flights out, But all civilians who show up must first pass through Taliban checkpoints to get here.
They attack on my sister with a gun. And again, that the American soldier stopped here and carried us in here. Now we don't know what should we do. When we go out of here.
This young woman fled the western city of Herat when Taliban fighters took over and tried to force her to marry one of them. And you're a doctor.
You are a doctor. Because just now, even the Taliban came to Herat city. I cannot even drive. I sold my car.
Like so many who come here, she has no visa and no flight out.
Do you think you're going to be able to get on an airplane?
I don't know.
Where do you want to go?
We don't know. Just I want to go there, be safe. Just feel alone.
You don't feel safe?
No.
People beg to be allowed in, aware that each day is one closer to the end of this eventual evacuation. The fear of being left behind is palpable.
For all the crowds that show up here, you've got the lucky ones over here who have visas and paperwork, and the soldiers are able to help them. They're able to show them into the airport, but you also have the unlucky ones. So many of them, just like these families here with newborn babies arguing with the soldiers trying to get them to move over so they can separate those who get to leave the country and those who don't. And all the while, those gunshots that you hear in the background, just beyond these vehicles, that's Taliban checkpoints, and they're firing off their rounds.
So that's just a sort of a taster of what it was like for people at the airport there in terms of the kind of level of chaos, and for the American soldiers as well, who were effectively having to become immigration officials overnight and who weren't really given any sense of what they were supposed to be doing with people who had partial paperwork, not all the paperwork. So I throughout the 10 days between the fall of Kabul and the explosion at the airport, we were really reporting on what it felt like for people who were there, the level of chaos, whether they were the soldiers, but also really all of these people who were trying to flee. And one thing that really struck me about the fact that I was standing in the street there was that I have never in all my years of covering Afghanistan noticed just how being around crowds of people where almost everyone speaks pretty good, if not fluent, English. I mean, there's plenty of people in Afghanistan who are educated, but this was a very concentrated group, an enormous brain drain, and especially when it came to women, to educated Afghan women. The woman who we profiled there, who we talked to, we returned to her in that story, but it's quite a long story. And she was actually a surgeon in Herat. Herat is a major Western city in the Western area of Afghanistan. And she was unmarried, and she was living with her mother and her sister. Her mother was a widow and her sister was divorced. And so the Taliban had come in and made a woman who was a highly educated medical professional give up her car. So someone would come every day because Herat had fallen several weeks before Kabul, and would have a male escort drive her to her job, which is reflective of the kind of absurdity of what women were facing back then and continue to today. And so, but I should point out though that the danger to women in Afghanistan and what they were going to be facing, certainly in light of these decisions, whether or not to stay or whether to go, was a topic that we'd been covering for quite some time at PBS. When the Taliban began negotiating officially, face-to-face, with the US administration in 2019, it was the Trump administration that had really opened these direct talks and were very keen to close a deal with the Taliban to leave. We went to Afghanistan, profiled a number of remarkable women who were doing interesting work, some of them in education, some of them in the fields of healthcare for women. And they vocalized to us their own fears about whether or not their rights, their hard-fought rights, would be maintained. And women at the time were not actually a part of those negotiations. The US did not stipulate that Afghan women should be involved in any of these negotiations in an official capacity. So women were very nervous, and they felt like they were being they were kind of being left in the dark about what was going to happen. It was in 2019 that I met a very special woman called Dr. Shifajo, Najmusama Shifajo, and she was one of the leading gynecologists in Afghanistan. So as part of this story, we decided to go and spend some time with her and really just give her a platform and let her talk about these issues. And I'm just going to introduce you guys to her and play a little bit of that story so you kind of get an idea of who she was and how important she was to this story. So here we are.
Special correspondent Jane Ferguson reports. In one of the toughest countries in the world to be a woman, this clinic offers a refuge. The Afghan women visiting Dr. Najmusama Shifajo this morning will get some of the best care in the country.
This is X-ray of the uterus and the fallopian tubes.
She is one of Afghanistan's top gynecologists, an expert on women's reproductive health.
Good morning.
Dr. Shifajo gave us a tour of her clinic, full of the latest technology that she imported herself. For the patients that you see, how important is this sort of equipment?
For the patient, it is we reach to the diagnosis soon, and there is no need to go outside the country.
So it saves lives.
Yeah, of course. This is the nose. This is the mouth.
To Dr. Shifajo, interaction with her patients is important.
Here, the mother sees the baby, her own ultrasound.
How do they react?
Yeah, they are very happy. Right now, they know this is the head, this is the heart, this is the stomach, because I teach them.
That's one reason women love coming here.
Mhm.
It would have been absolutely unthinkable for Afghan women just 20, even 10 years ago to have had this kind of technology. Dr. Shifajo knows that all too well. She began her career delivering babies on mud floors in Taliban-controlled parts of the country.
When you were working underneath Taliban rule, did you ever imagine that one day you'd have a clinic like this, equipment like this?
I had a hope.
You pictured it.
Yeah.
Since the US invasion, Afghan women like Dr. Shifajo have, through their own hard work and self-belief, built incredible new lives. That's why today they watch the news anxiously. A major campaign promise by President Trump was to bring American troops home. And in September, he came close to making a deal with the Taliban after more than 9 months of negotiations in Qatar. Negotiations where Afghan women quite literally had no seat at the table.
Okay, so this is a longer story, and if you're curious at all, you can go and watch that piece from 2019 where we on the NewsHour profile other women, including an educator who set up a set of mobile libraries for children at schools, where schools that didn't have very good books or very good collections of books could use this service, and they would show up at schools, and the children would come on the bus and read or borrow a book. And it was the first time they'd had mobile libraries in Afghanistan. Now, the woman who had set up that mobile library was very young, in her 20s, and she had to flee Kabul whenever it fell. But Dr. Shifajo stayed and relayed to me the story of what it was like to be there when Kabul stayed. And this is another reason I bring her up and wanted to go back and revisit her and talk to her from the perspective of immigration. She is a classic example of one of the more painful examples of someone who did not want to leave Afghanistan, who had built her entire career and life and family and purpose around serving the women of her country. And so I was very keen to go back and talk to Dr. Shifajo after the fall. I returned in late October, early November of 2021. The Taliban had been in control for several months. I wanted to see from her perspective what life was like. And so I'm just going to play a little bit of that video so you guys can see her a few years later.
We came back to Kabul several months into Taliban rule to find Dr. Shifajo changed, her spirit diminished. The futures she dreamed of for her daughters, gone. After their takeover, the Taliban banned all girls from attending public school. A few months later, they relented, allowing those under age 12 to go for an education. Dr. Shifajo decided to send none of her girls, encouraging solidarity among the sisters.
You're an educated woman working in an elite field with a 14-year-old daughter who's not allowed to go to school. How does that feel?
My two kids are small. They are allowed to go to school. They are under the 6th class.
Under
But-
6th grade?
Yes, under 6th grade. But my eldest daughter is at 8th grade. So she is not allowed to go to school. That's why I do not allow the two youngest one as well. She will feel that I'm at home and do not study, and these two my sisters are going to the school. That's why she will be disappointed.
She pushes them to study independently at home, but knows an even more painful choice lies ahead.
Although I love my country, I love women, I love my patients, and I love my job a lot, like my kids, like my heart, like my body. But still, I have to go outside the country because of my kids.
Dr. Shifajo never feared the Taliban and chose to stay in Kabul to provide services to her patients. But she fights two battles now, a mother's love for her children and a dedication to her patients.
I love both of them a lot, but in comparison, my career and me are one person, but my kids are 3, and they should have bright future. And because of them, I can leave everything.
It's impossible to overstate what she leaves behind as an Afghan, as a doctor, and as a self-made professional.
It took 48 years to reach my goal, and I will not have this much life to start from the zero until I reach my goal. So it will take so much time. One of my friend went to Canada, and she was very good, very famous, and very professional doctor in Afghanistan. Over there, she is nothing, but she went because of her kids.
That is all too common for many here fleeing for Western countries, once top specialists in their field, now trying to get qualified for assistance work.
Right now, also, I am depressed, and I take medication for depression. My condition will deteriorate a lot, and I know I will lose everything because I invest all of my money in my hospital. I do not have anything in my hand, but I'm thinking about my kids.
Dr. Shifajo doesn't know yet when or where she will go. Getting visas to move abroad is tough for Afghans, but she is resolute about getting her daughters out of here and into a classroom, anywhere. The choice she is making, the sacrifice, is one countless Afghan men and women will continue to make as they flee for the sake of their children, surrendering their whole life's work in hopes their sons and daughters will never have to make the choices they did. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jane Ferguson.
Right. So I really wanted to share that with you. I know it's a pretty depressing story, but I should have given you some background context before sharing the second half. I'm sure you guys are probably aware anyway that the Taliban, as soon as they came in, banned education for girls age 14 or over. And so her eldest daughter had just reached that age. On top of that, some other context is that, and it was sort of in the center of that piece, is that, you know, for so many of people like Dr. Shifajo, it's very, very expensive and time consuming and almost impossible to get re-qualified for your work, whether you're a doctor or you are a chemist. It can be extraordinarily difficult to be allowed to practice. You effectively have to go back to university. The idea that someone like her could fly over with her kids, get the visa, get to the United States, make it here, and with very little money, and suddenly be able to go back to medical school. It's almost all but impossible. But I wanted to really bring up Dr. Shifajo as a real example of, what we try to communicate as broadcasters and as journalists about the immigration story, especially about those who flee war. I think so often, whenever I'm talking to viewers and the public generally, when they look at immigration, they see very often economic migration, which is a separate issue, but also they assume that, and they often make assumptions. We all make assumptions about immigrants sometimes, presuming that they are trying to come to the United States because it betters their economic future or betters their career, which is the case for a lot of people, but certainly not always the case for those who are war refugees. And we may make assumptions about just how educated people are, what kind of life experience they have, and what they've left behind. Making the assumption that someone has a higher quality of life in the United States is not always true. I often really want people to understand what it is like to give everything up. What does it really mean to, quote unquote, leave everything behind? Obviously, for many people coming from middle classes, that is, property and homes and community, that sense of community, culture, knowing where you came from. But for professionals as well, it is truly, truly giving up everything you've spent your whole life building towards. Some of my closest friends who are Afghan American journalists, their parents fled the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And actually, the producer who worked with me on this story is an Afghan American from California. And he had grown up in California, been born in Kabul, didn't have very many memories from there, had been brought to California as a little kid. And his father was a doctor. He was a very senior, well-respected doctor, and his mother was a nurse. And they were really part of sort of upper society in Kabul in the 70s. And when they got to California, his mother's first job was sweeping the car park in a Taco Bell. Now they were lucky to have work. They worked hard. They built a new life and a new career and raised their family and sent their kids to college. But Ali, my producer, telling me the stories of his family really was forefront in my mind when we went back to talk to Dr. Shifajo later about how we had, not only has this befallen her family, but this is so often a cyclical problem where people or an entire family were set back professionally and economically, as well as being displaced by several generations, potentially, at least one whole generation. And so it's very important, I think, in our reporting to really remind people of what it is that people are leaving behind and the kind of traumas that they're bringing with them whenever they arrive as migrants and as immigrants and war refugees into places like the United States. And as we get into a political cycle where immigration is so politicized, it's become such a hot button topic. I think for me and for many of us who are covering these issues at the source, at least for those fleeing conflict, it's very important that we work with real people, and so we can introduce these characters to our viewers, and they can really understand an actual human being behind what is a geopolitical story, a big news of the day piece. It's a political hot button topic, but essentially reminding our viewers what it is like for individuals who have to experience this form of immigration is the most important thing to those of us doing this kind of work. Now, I'd love to throw back to you guys just for any kind of questions that you might have on the subject, on any of the work at all. I'd be delighted to answer any questions.
Yeah, right. Thank you so much, Jane. I'm actually going to pass it because we already have a question in the back.
Hello, I'm Samantha. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. But we all want to know, where's the doctor now?
Pardon me? Where is she now?
Yep. Yes.
Well, she managed to get a visa to Turkey. And so so she was able to get her family out and to Turkey at the minute. There's a lot of Afghans who are in places like Istanbul. So Dr. Shifajo made it to Turkey in the end. But my understanding is that she's not able to practice medicine there.
Any other questions or even comments if something's resonating with you? I think Jade would love to know.
So hi, my name is Fadi. I am from Jordan. So I have a question. Is there any report about like immigrants coming to the States and how it's difficult for them to find jobs? Like I know, like I am an Arabic teacher at Chicago Public Schools, and I know a lot of people coming, for example, from Jordan, and they have PhD and they used to teach at universities, and they cannot teach in elementary or elementary school. They have to take tests and stuff like that. If there is any like reports about these kind of stuff, how it's difficult. Like I'm talking about the doctor from Afghanistan, but there is a lot of people I know here. Like I know a doctor who he cannot work as a nurse in hospital, but he used to do surgeries in Jordan. You know what I mean? So is there any reports about these kind of stuff?
Well, I remember during the war in Syria, whenever you had it was much more in the forefront of the reporting that, you know, that there was discussion of what it was like to flee and make it to the United States. I don't personally think there's enough reporting done about the fact that I think most people don't realize that educated people coming from places like Jordan are not allowed to work in those particular medical fields. I worked as a volunteer with an organization called Upwardly Global, which is an organization that basically tries to get people funding so they can go back and re-qualify, so they can go and sit those exams. So if you're a doctor and you arrive and you need to basically do another 2 years in university, they try to get them there. But the problem is that it's very expensive, and a lot of people who arrive in the country don't really know how to go about. You know, there need to be more resources for people to understand how they can at least apply for grants to get requalified. Another big problem is a lot of people fly out with families, so they, you know, even if they get funding to go to college, they have to provide for many of the people that are with them, their kids, and that's a big issue. I do think it should be written about a lot more. It's really an issue of a massive brain drain. The whole idea of organizations like Upwardly Global is to make sure you don't have orthodontists driving Ubers. You know, like it's a waste of the potential of immigrants who are coming in to the United States. There have been more pushes, especially to get women who are immigrants working and hired in the workplace, especially those who are war refugees, because as families come here and the cost of living is extremely high, having one income household is often not really practical, and a lot of those women do need help as well getting into the workforce. But there should be more reporting on this issue of professionals who are coming and trying to get into work.
Hi, Jane. Thank you. My question is about, as an educator, how can I help my students feel like they can take action in these sort of events, or what can they do as American youth? What sort of things are going on in America, or even, you know, globally, to help the young people, but then also communities incorporate the refugees?
Sure. Well, that's a great question, and I get asked a lot, you know, what can we do? How can we help? Now, I think every sort of local community has, has some resources, especially whenever you do have places where refugees are coming in. With Afghans in particular, you know, looking up local organizations that have been reaching out to Afghans. I know I've spoken to Afghans who have who have been in places like Oklahoma, and it's been like local church organizations have had outreach projects with them, or it could be veterans organizations, especially when it comes to those who were translators. Many of them arrive with large families, and so the veteran organizations have been particularly active, and they might be able to guide you towards where to help people. Local mosques that tends to be more of a focal point, or a community focal point for Afghans that are arriving in. And that's but everywhere in America has like local immigration community officers, and so mapping out where you come from, which organizations are helping Afghans the most, contacting those organizations and saying, how can I help? A lot of the time when people first arrived, it was a case of helping with how do they get their kids into schools? How do they, figure out even figuring out public transport? So the ability to volunteer with communities is hugely important. And any of those organizations might be able to help you find out, if there are programs with the children, because a lot of Afghan children have been going to sort of outreach programs, and local communities have been inviting them along to various events to sort of try to help with the kids and help them make friends and integrate.
Hi, Jane. This is Bara Saraj. I teach microbiology here in the city colleges of Chicago. So I connect fully with your story about what the Afghans are going through. I myself and all the refugees from Syria, and my story is maybe well known at the local or international level. My question to you is this, and maybe you are familiar with this. So I'm always surprised why the American administration at the time, why didn't they guarantee through their negotiations? Because I cannot disconnect the plight of the Afghani people from that political track. Why didn't the American administration guarantee the rights of those people they left behind? It's always linked to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the biggest question, really. I mean, the decision, I think, first of all, when we're looking at rights, we have the Afghan military translators, also anybody in the Afghan military, special forces, those who were instrumental on the battlefield. As America was leaving and was negotiating to leave, they were very well aware that their lives were very much at risk. The reality was they were never really going to be able to take the Taliban's word for it that they would not exact retribution against these people. And so that's why the United States was supposed to be, instead of trying to guarantee their rights, which they could never do when they're not in their country. And also they're dealing with a group like the Taliban, which is sort of disparate and very fractured, and very, very low discipline. They offered them these SIV, the special immigrant visas, were meant to be the answer, where those who are most at risk and their families would be pulled out of the country. And the plan was that they would leave the country before Kabul fell. Now, that even before Kabul fell, that was never going to happen because the SIV program was too slow. The processing of those visas was laughably slow. And you had very senior members of the military, like General Petraeus, and many other senior figures saying, this is an emergency. By the time we got to July 2021, I'd been writing about this topic, that the SIV process was an emergency. Many of these people were never going to get these visas in time. Now, the administration would say, well, we couldn't have known that Kabul would fall so quickly, that Ashraf Ghani would just flee the country. I think that took most people by surprise. But yeah, the plan wasn't to guarantee their rights. The plan was to try to guarantee them a way out, which was very patchy in its execution. Now, as an aside, I would say that a bigger question on a lot of people's minds has been, why was there not more of an emphasis on protecting women's rights? Within the agreement with the Taliban, they promised to provide women's rights, quote, within an Islamic framework, which of course is extremely vague and subject to interpretation. So the Taliban essentially have done whatever they wanted. And many Afghan women have said to me and my colleagues since that they feel like their rights were sacrificed for the political gain, for politicians who were able to say we ended the war. And I think, unfortunately, the ugly truth is that the end of the war in Afghanistan became a set of very, very difficult priorities, bringing home the troops, ending the war, being able to say you've ended a war, what became more important than a lot of the considerations for rights, unfortunately. That became the harsh reality.
Just a follow-up question. That would be a final question for the sake of time. Did you have the chance to talk to Taliban? Why they have this? I heard many interpretations. That's we don't have the money. That's ridiculous. But why? Why are they doing that? So
I've talked to the Taliban,
and I don't think that exists in Islam, that you forbade women from learning.
Exactly. There's no Islamic country in the world. There are no Islamic scholars who agree with this. Everyone from Saudi Arabia to Al-Azhar University in Cairo, there are no credible Islamic jurisprudence or anybody in the Islamic sort of academia world. Nobody believes this to be the case. This is more about the cultures that within Taliban, where they're from. It's more to do with their own culture than it is with religion. However, the problem is when you talk to the Taliban, and this has been one of the main challenges for women, for anybody trying to negotiate with them, is that you get a different answer every time, because the reality is the Taliban can't point to a religious justification. And in some cases they will, for things like clothing or for things like whether or not people are allowed to view movies or music. They will have a theological argument that is, of course, an extraordinarily extreme interpretation of their scripture. However, when it comes to women's education, they are always unable to say why, which is why they come up with, as you have pointed out, absurd comments like, "Oh, we don't have the money; it's too expensive." Then they'll say, "Well, it's too dangerous. It's there's the security situation isn't right just yet." And then they'll come up with the story of, "Well, we just don't have enough teachers for them." They can't come up with a legitimate, authentic argument in terms of Islamic law and rule. So they usually come up with various subjects that are then basically dancing around the fact that in reality, the Taliban are under massive amounts of pressure to be hardline. They're very worried about losing younger, more extreme, more radical fighters to rival groups like ISIS. They have no money to pay them. A lot of these soldiers are barely even getting fed, never mind paid. So I think that they really try to bolster their own credentials amongst the hardliners by taking it out on women.
Jane Simmons, again, I have a question. In terms of you and yourself, how do you care for yourself when you're in those extreme situations? Like when you were talking to the woman from Herat, who you said would most likely not be able to get a visa and get out. How do you, I don't know, in a sense, distance yourself from that? I can't imagine that feeling of helplessness that you would feel when you're there reporting. And I wondered how you're able to sort of balance that situation with, your own head and your own heart.
Yeah, I mean, that's for all journalists covering conflicts and crises like this, that is the worst part of our job. It's very, very hard because, whether or not you're in a hospital ward where there are malnourished babies as a result of a famine in Yemen, or you are, at Kabul airport and people are asking you for help and you can't help this one person in front of you. That's the biggest challenge, but the situation in Afghanistan was very extreme. I have faced, famines and revolutions and conflicts and civil war, but I'd never seen anything like this before. So it was very extreme for me. When I got home, I realized I had lost 10% of my body weight in 10 days. It was the most physically and emotionally draining experience of my life. And I've, done a lot of tough stuff on the road. And so I took a lot of time off. I didn't really work from, on the road. I was at home, I was writing, I was doing public speaking, but I didn't travel as much after that for several months. I think taking time off and having time to rest and process is really, really important. And a lot of us journalists really lean on each other because we know what the experience is like. So I get to lean on my colleagues a lot, and we all support each other and spend time around one another. It's kind of why we're a bit of a tribe. When you come home from an experience like that, you don't really want, the people that you're talking to can't really understand. So it's helpful to have people who do, and to really lean into those friendships and spend time with them.
Well, Jane, thank you so much for your amazing presentation. I'm over here. Thank you so much for your amazing presentation. It's okay. I'd love to just give you the floor if you have any closing remarks before we, let you go off into the rest of your day.
Sure. Well, I'll just answer a question that wasn't asked, but that's because I do get asked it a fair bit by teachers and educators. They say, and it's a big part of what the Pulitzer Center does as we do these outreaches is, really trying to get people to watch and absorb really quality reporting that is, relevant to today's stories. And I would just say, educators ask me a lot, how do I present this, talk about this with students? It's so big and geopolitical, and it sort of sounds kind of dull. Maybe it might sound too heavy. It also might sound really, really upsetting. And I just think I would just say, really, really try to seek out those stories, like the one about Dr. Shifajo, stories with strong characters. People connect with other human beings, and there are so many stories out there now with children and what it's like for children and young people who are going through these experiences, whether or not it's a story in Maui, with the situation that's happening in Hawaii right now, or whether it's a story, in Niger with the coup. Ongoing stories, just seeking out quality reporting that has real characters and human beings in it. So young people can connect with that. I think that's definitely, it's out there. It's all over YouTube, whether it's good quality PBS reporting. The Frontline documentaries are incredible. They're all online, all free, all available to watch at all times. That's a great resource too. And so yeah, I think that really looking for that character-driven storytelling I do believe can engage young people. I do think that they are hungry for that kind of information.
Thank you so much, Jane. Let's give Jane a round of applause.
Hope you have a great afternoon. And we'll see you next time, Jane.
Yeah, see you later. Bye.